where we got to last week. Acts 23, verse 31. Let's talk about a few things that we discussed last week, and then we'll pick up here in verse 31 here in just a minute. Of course, we were talking about Paul and some of the different people that he had met in chapter number 23. And in verse 11 last week, we saw where he met the Lord Jesus Christ again. Jesus appeared to him. We talked a little bit about it. It was only one verse, but it was a powerful message to the Apostle Paul. It was a message of courage. We talked about that. A message of commendation and a message of confidence when the Lord met with the Apostle Paul there once again. And then we saw where Paul was having to deal with these Jewish conspirators, how they had conspired a plot to put him to death. And we talked about that. Verses 12 and 13. There were more than 40 Jews had bound themselves together with an oath that they would not eat or they would not drink anything until they had actually killed the Apostle Paul. Verse 14 and 15, they went to the chief priest and asked, told them and told Claudius to bring him down before the council again, the Sanhedrin. And then while they were making that trip, they would ambush him and they would kill him. Verse number 16, this word of this plot got to Paul's nephew, and he went and he told the Apostle Paul. Paul was in custody there. Verses 17 through 22, we see where Paul's nephew proceeded to go tell the chief captain, Claudius Lysias, of this plot that he had found out about, that they were going to kill his uncle, the Apostle Paul. Verse 24, Claudius apparently believed it because he made these special precautions to get the Apostle Paul from Jerusalem down to Caesarea so he could appear before Felix, the governor. And we talked about how he prepared 470 men just to take one man from Jerusalem down to Caesarea, and they also did it by the cover of night. So he took about as many precautions as a person could to get Paul safely to the governor there in Caesarea. And then we finished up looking at this letter here that Claudius had actually written ahead of time to send to the governor Felix, kind of let him know, get him up to speed on things that were going on. Verse 25 through 27, we saw that he was not 100% truthful because he said that he knew that Paul was a Roman, and so him and his soldiers protected him, and they did protect the Apostle Paul multiple times. But the first time wasn't because he was a Roman. They thought he was some kind of an Egyptian rebel, so he kind of slanted the truth there just a little bit. Verse 28 and 29, Claudius, we talked about how Claudius, as well as most Roman officials, when it came to that, they didn't harbor a whole lot of resentment or anything against the Apostle Paul. It was always the Jews that was giving him trouble, and even Claudius said that he hadn't done anything worthy of death or even bonds. In verse number 30, Claudius finished up his letter saying, of course, that he would send Paul to the governor down to Caesarea, and he'd also send this letter that he had penned down, that he had written, and that also that his accusers, though, needed to be there as well when he appeared before the governor. And he also told him about this plot that these unbelieving Jews had put together to try to kill the Apostle Paul. So he informed the governor there of all these things that had happened and why he was sending the Apostle Paul down to him. So that got us down to verse number 31 here in chapter 23. So I'll read verses 31 through 35, and we'll see where Paul is actually taken from Jerusalem down to Caesarea, up to Caesarea actually, and then where he will appear before Felix, the governor. So verse 31 here says, Then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the morrow they left the horsemen to go with him and returned to the castle, who, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. And when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was, and when he understood that he was of Cilicia, I will hear thee, said he, when thine accusers are also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. So we see here where the Apostle Paul is taken from Jerusalem down to Caesarea. Verse number 31, here we see where these 470 men that Claudius Lysias had put together, they took the Apostle Paul. It says by night, of course they left in the cover of night. It said they took him as far as Antipatris. Now that was about 37 miles northwest of Jerusalem, so they took him that far, about halfway, almost a little over halfway from Jerusalem to Caesarea. So they took him that far. And in verse 32 it says, on the morrow they left the horsemen to go with him, and they returned to the castle. So they figured that was far enough away that the Apostle Paul should be out of trouble, should be out of harm's way from these Jewish unbelieving Jews that were wanting to kill him. So they took him that far, and only the 70 horsemen remained with Paul. And it says everybody else, the rest of them, the other 400, they returned back to Jerusalem. So now, Paul here, he's as far as Antipatris, and then only the 70 horsemen remain with him. Well, verse 33 says, who when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. So they went on down they went up to Caesarea, and it was about 27 miles from this city of Antipatris. And once there, of course, they turned Paul over to the governor Felix, as well as this letter that Claudius Lysias had written to let him know exactly the things, let Felix know exactly what was going on. Well, verse 35 says, when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was. And when he understood that he was of Cilicia, he says, I will hear thee, he said, when thine accusers are also come. So when Felix, he got the letter and found out that Paul was from Cilicia, remember he was from the city of Tarsus, that's where Paul was from, he agreed to hear this case, Felix, the governor did. But he said, though, that his accusers needed to be present as well before he would actually hear the case and hear the matter, so he could hear both sides of the story, because he had already got kind of sort of Paul's side by the letter that Claudius had written, but he didn't know the other side of the story, these Jews. And there's always two sides to every story, and so he wanted to hear the whole story before he actually heard the case. In the last part of verse number 35, it says that he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. So not only was Paul escorted down there by an escort fit for a king, but once he got there, he was actually put in the palace that was built by Herod the Great. It says Herod's judgment hall here. He was not put in just some common prison, but he was set up in a pretty nice place here once they brought him down there and got him to Governor Felix. And so we see Paul now, he was probably safe, or he was safe from these Jewish conspirators that were plotting to put him together. But once he got there, would he actually be safe from Felix? Now, the Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot about Felix, but historians tell us a little bit about him. And let me just read one paragraph here in this commentary I've been reading about just a little bit about Felix. It says, and Antonius Felix was governor, of course, of Judea, and he was married to Drusilla, a Jewish who was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I. And she had left her husband to become Felix's third wife. She was sister of Herod Agrippa II, and the Roman historian Tacitus tells us that Felix exercised the power of a king in the spirit of a slave. Felix was called a vulgar ruffian and lived up to that name. So even though the Apostle Paul, he was safe from the Jews, but would he be safe from Felix, the governor, because he was known as sometimes not being a very nice man. So we'll see what happens to Paul when he does appear before Felix here in chapter number 24, as we'll get into next. Now remember, chapter 20 through 23, we titled Paul the Prisoner. Well, chapter 24, we could probably entitle it Paul the Witness. And Paul was continuing to do what he told the Ephesian elders back in Miletus, back in Acts chapter 20, verse number 24, remember what he told the Ephesian elders? He says, "But none of these things move me, neither count I my life dear unto myself, so that I might finish my course with joy in the ministry which I have received of the Lord Jesus, to testify the gospel of the grace of God." So the Apostle Paul was continuing to do that through all this danger that he had found himself in. He was continuing to be that witness and to testify of the Lord Jesus Christ. So chapter 24, we'll call it Paul the witness, and we'll see the Roman legal system at work here. In chapter number 24, three different people in particular that we'll be dealing with in this chapter. First, of course, we'll see Tertullus, and we'll see some of the false accusations that he made against the Apostle Paul, verses 1 through 9. And we'll call him the lawyer. Tertullus, we'll call him the lawyer. And then we see Paul, he gives his some faithful answers to these false accusations that Tertullus gives in verses 20 through 21. So, of course, Paul is the witness. And then we'll see Felix, and we'll see some of his foolish attitudes that he has at the end of the chapter, in verses 22 through 27. And, of course, we'll call Felix the judge. So we have the lawyer, we have the witness, and we have the judge here that we'll see here in chapter number 24. Again, this Roman legal system that we'll see. So let's read here in chapter 24, verses 1 through 9, and see what Tertullus here has to say about the Apostle Paul. In chapter 24, verse number 1, "And after 5 days, Ananias, the high priest, descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, Seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence. We accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of the clemency of thy clemency a few words. For we have found this man, a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. But the chief captain Lysias came upon us with great violence, took him away out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come unto thee, by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. And the Jews also assenting, saying that these things were so." So we see here some things, some of these accusations, most of them false, that Tertullus made against the Apostle Paul here in front of Felix the governor. Well, the first part of verse number 1 talks about how Ananias and the high priest descending with the elders. And, of course, they were going from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and it says they descended per Felix's request, because that was one of his requests. Also Claudius Lysias, the chief captain, that these accusers needed to be present. So it says they descended. And remember, of course, we've talked about this multiple times. Anytime you talk about going to Jerusalem, it talks about going up to Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem was actually south of Caesarea. They came to Jerusalem here as the Felix the governor had requested, also as Claudius had requested. So they came down. It says Ananias and the high priest. But it says also there was a certain orator named Tertullus who informed the governor against Paul. So they brought this man Tertullus, and actually he says he was a chief orator. An orator, we know that just means a speaker. But this was possibly the Jews' lawyer that they had picked to go down and argue their case in front of the governor because of some of the things that they were accusing Paul of. And all we know about this man is what Luke records here in these few verses here, chapter number 24. That's all we know about this man Tertullus. But anyway, verse 2 and 3, he begins, of course, his customary flattery of the governor to start his speech. And he says, he said, when he began to accuse him, he said, "Seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence. We accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness." So he began to give this flattery to Felix, the governor, and that's not uncommon. We even see it today in our legal system. A lawyer, they want to kind of butter up the judge, maybe to make it a little bit better on them and on they're the ones that they're defending. So he was giving him a lot of complimentary things. He was flattering him. But Solomon, though, the wisest man, of course, we have a record of in the Bible. He says that's not the thing to do. He says in Proverbs 26:28, he says, a lying tongue hateth those that are afflicted by it, and a flattering mouth worketh ruin. So it's not really something that Tertullus here needed to be doing. He didn't need to be giving Felix all this flattery. But he complimented him by stating that his reforms had brought about all this quietness and all this peace in the land. Well, I don't know that was particularly true. Why, if that was true, why would it have taken 470 men to bring one man all the way from Jerusalem to Caesarea if there was that much quietness in the land? So that statement may or may not have been true. Well, he continued to pile it on, verse number 3, calling him most noble Felix. So Felix's head is probably starting to swell at this particular time because all these wonderful words here that Tertullus was saying to him. And verse number 4, he goes on, he says, notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency. A few words. So he continues to tell him that, you have great gentleness. That's what the word clemency means. So again, knowing Felix, based on some of the history that we've read about him, this was probably not true about this man. But Tertullus, he was wanting to make him feel good, make Felix feel good before he started his charges here against the Apostle Paul. Well, once he starts them here in verse number 5, he actually makes 3 different charges against the Apostle Paul. We see first, there was a personal one. He called him a pest. Basically, he said this is a pestilent fellow. So it was a personal charge. Then we see a political charge. He said that he was committing a sedition and he was leading an illegal religion in the land. We'll talk about that a little bit here in just a second. It was also a doctrinal charge. He says he was profaning or he was polluting the temple. So these are the 3 charges here that Tertullus was accusing Paul of. Well, the first part of verse number 5, we see the personal one. He says, for we have found this man a pestilent fellow. And again, it just means a pest. That's what pestilent means. And it was based on all the conflicts that Paul had with a lot of the unbelieving Jews in all the different places that he went. But it was always the Jews that was causing trouble, not Paul. I mean, he was just going, teaching, preaching, and, being a witness for the Lord. But it was the Jews that was always causing the problems. So therefore, they considered him to be a pest or a pestilent fellow. Well, the second one was a political one. It was a little bit more serious. He goes on to say, he says he's a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So, no Roman official wanted to be guilty of permitting some kind of illegal activities that would upset Rome or that would upset Caesar. And sedition, of course, just means here controversy or uprising. So this statement here by Tertullus, it got Felix's attention. Again, because no Roman official wanted to be found guilty of that, even though it seemed to be maybe somewhat of a slight exaggeration of this sedition among the Jews. But how many times even in today do we see lawyers or whomever it may be stretching the truth a little, in a court case? It was common then, it's common still today. Again, just some partial truths here that Tertullus was presenting before the governor Felix, because now it was illegal back then for a new religion to be established in Rome without the permission of the authorities. And so if Paul was indeed a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, as Tertullus accused him of here, this might give him a case, maybe maybe to build a case against them if this were actually true. So that's why Tertullus was using this accusation. So we see the personal accusation here. He was a pest. The second one was political because they weren't supposed to have a religion, an illegal religion. And the third one was a doctrinal one. Verse number 6, it says, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. So this third one was a doctrinal one, that Paul had actually profaned the temple. He had polluted the temple there at Jerusalem, which, should not have been done. And the reason they accused him of that is they thought that he had actually brought these Gentiles into the part of the temple that they weren't supposed to cross. We talked about that several weeks ago, about, there was a barricade put up, and there were certain parts of the temple that Gentiles were not allowed to be in. So they thought that he had brought these Gentiles into the temple and therefore had profaned or had polluted the temple. Well, these were just assumptions, though, because Paul had Gentile friends, and he had brought Gentile friends with him to Jerusalem. And remember, one of them was named Trophimus, and Ephesian was named back in Acts chapter 21, verse number 29. So these were just assumptions here on their part that he had actually brought these Gentiles into the temple. So those were the three charges here that he had brought personally against the Apostle Paul. Verse number 7, he continues, but the chief captain Lysias Claudius Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands. So he had to be careful here, Tertullus did, about maybe what he said about Claudius Lysias, because he was employed by the same Roman government as Governor Felix was. So he had to be careful here, maybe what he had to say, and not say too many bad things about Claudius here, because after all, Claudius had saved a man's life multiple times. The Apostle Paul, he had saved his life multiple times, so he had to be careful here what he had to say. And again, he exaggerated possibly just a little bit there as well. He said he came and took him with great violence. He came and took him away. I don't know that that's necessarily true. They were about to kill the Apostle Paul, remember, back in chapter number 21. So he just came in and saved his life. He just rescued him. So again, Tertullus here exaggerates just a little bit more. Well, he closes here, his argument here, verse number 8. He says, commanding his accusers to come unto thee by examining of whom thou thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. So he closed here by telling that Claudius had also asked that his accusers come as well. Now, this part, of course, was true. The accusers needed to come as well as the Apostle Paul, so we get both sides of the story. Verse number 9, and the Jews were also assented, saying these things were so. Because, of course, the Jews that had hired him to come and be their lawyer, they were going to agree with everything he had to say. There's no way they were going to disagree. So they agreed with all these accusations here that Tertullus had made against the Apostle Paul. So we've seen here so far Tertullus and these false accusations here in verses 1 through 9. Well, now we're going to see Paul, the witness. Remember, that's what we're going to call chapter number 24, Paul the witness. So we're going to see some of his faithful answers that he gives here in verses 10 through 21 to these accusations that Tertullus had made. So let me read these verses. Verse number 10 through verse number 21 says, Then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, For as much as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship. And they neither found me in the temple, disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues, nor in the city. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing in all things which are written in the law and in the prophets, and have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. And I herein do exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. Now after many years I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings, whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult. Who ought to have been here before thee, and object if they had aught against me, or else Let these same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me while I stood before the council, except it be for this one voice that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day. So we see here some of the answers here he gives to what Tertullus had accused him of. So back to verse number 10, Paul, after the governor had beckoned him to speak, probably, he may just motioned him, gave him a head nod, we don't know, but he told Paul, okay, basically it's your turn to speak. And Paul here, he didn't flatter Felix like Tertullus had done, back in verses 2, 3, and 4, but he simply just acknowledged that Felix was a man of experience and therefore should be a man of knowledge and hear these matters. Well, verse number 11, it says, because thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up for Jerusalem to worship. So he started here by reminding Felix of the timeline of some of these accusations that Tertullus had made. And how in the world could Paul have had time to organize all this and do the things that they had accused him of, especially the assault on the temple. And let me just read you the order of events here. Remember, he says it had only been 12 days prior since he had been up to Jerusalem. Counting the time, of course, here he was at Caesarea. Well, day 1, of course, we know Paul arrived in Jerusalem, chapter 21, verse number 17. Day 2, we saw, remember, he met with James and the elders, chapter 21, verse number 18. And then we saw him in day 3. He was actually in the temple with the Nazarites. Remember, he had purified himself with them. Chapter 21, verse 26. Well, day 4 and day 5, he continued there in the temple, there at Jerusalem. On day 6 is when he was arrested in the temple. Chapter 21, verse 27. Day 7, he met with the Jewish council. In chapter 23, verses 1 through 10, talked about that last week. Day 8, he was threatened and taken to Caesarea. Chapter 23, verses 12, verse 23. And then we've talked about today already. Day 9, he arrived in Caesarea. Chapter 23, verse 33. Day 10, he waited for Felix as Felix sent for the Jewish leaders to come. Day 11, he continued to wait for the Jewish leaders to arrive. Day 12, he was still waiting. They finally arrived, and the hearing was scheduled. And then in day 13, the hearing was conducted. So he said, he had only been 12 days prior. And so how in the world could I have had time to do all these things? Tertullus has accused me. Verse 12 and 13, Paul continued on. He says, and they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues, nor in the city, neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. So he went on to say, he says, there's no way. They have no proof of these things that Tertullus is accusing me of. He says he was not, remember, going back to chapter 21, he was not disputing in the temple. He was there to worship in the temple with these 4 Nazarites that he had been with them during their 7 days of purification. He did not cause a disturbance once he got into the temple. Remember, it was the Jews from Asia, the Ephesian Jews, are the ones that actually started causing the disturbance and causing the trouble. And it says this particular time, now Paul's custom normally was he would preach in the synagogues, but we're not told he did that when he came to Jerusalem this time. He says he didn't even preach in the synagogues or even in the city there at Jerusalem. So he says you can't prove these things that you're accusing me of, and causing a disturbance there in the temple. Well, verse 14, he goes on to address the sedition part. He says, but this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. He says, I'm still worshiping the same God as my forefathers have been teaching about and preaching about through the years. He says, it's the same God. He says, I'm just worshiping him now in a new and a living way, and that I accept Jesus Christ as the Messiah that the Old Testament scriptures had been prophesying all along, because he says they were written in the law and in the prophets. So he says there hasn't been any heresy on my part. He says I'm worshiping the same God. Well, verse 15, he continues. He says, I have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there should be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and of the unjust. And he continues to tell Felix here that even his forefathers believed in a in a resurrection, and he later in verse 21 he tells them that's really the only reason that I'm here. It says that's why I'm called into question this day, because of the resurrection, because I talk about the resurrection. Remember in Jesus' ministry, he even reminded the Sadducees. Remember the Sadducees, of course, they didn't believe in any type of resurrection at all. He reminded them one time in his ministry how that even their forefathers, the Jews back in the Old Testament, they even believed in a resurrection. Matthew 22 verses 31 and 32, he says, but as touching the resurrection of the dead, have you not read that which was spoken unto you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. So he says, look, he says, your forefathers even believed in a resurrection. That's what he told them here in verse number 15. But he goes on, verse number 16, he says, and herein do I exercise myself, to have always a good conscience, void of offense toward God and toward men. So Paul talks about his conscience again. Remember, we talked about that some last week or week before, how he always lived in a good conscience after, of course, his conversion, and he still did the same thing today. He had a good conscience, and his number one priority was to please the Lord and to witness for the Lord and testify of the grace of the Lord. In verse 17, he continues. He says, but now after many years, I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings. So he proceeded here to answer this false accusation by the Asian Jews that he had actually profaned the temple. He told Felix, he says, I didn't go to Jerusalem to defile the temple. I didn't go there to profane or to pollute the temple. He says, I went to take this offering to my Jewish brethren. Remember how Paul had been taking up this offering during his journeys to take and give to the people, his Jewish people there at Jerusalem. He tells Felix here, verse 17, he says, that's why I came. He says, that's the main reason I came. In verse number 18, he says, whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult. So he goes on to say that even when they saw him there in the temple, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He had even been purified himself. The Apostle Paul had been purified himself, remember, with the 4 Nazarites. And he was not causing any trouble. He was not causing any disturbance whatsoever. And he reminds Governor Felix of this. He goes on to verse number 19, he says, who all, again talking about the Asian Jews there that were bringing these accusations against him back in chapter 21. He says, who ought to have been here before thee and object if they had aught against me. So, Paul knew Roman law, and he knew that the accusers were to face the accused at the trial, or charges could possibly be dropped if the accusers weren't there. And he says, look, he says these Asian Jews, these Ephesian Jews, these unbelieving Jews, says they're not even here. And they're the ones that brought these accusations against me first in chapter number 21. So, so much for this part of the accusations, because they weren't even there at this particular time. And Paul knew, based on Roman law, that they needed to be there. Verse number 20 says, or else let these same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me, while I stood before the council. So Paul says even the council really didn't find any evil doing against him. They just continued to harass him and refused to actually hear what he had to say. The Sanhedrin did, the court, when he was before them, and he reminds Felix of this same thing as well. And he goes on, verse number 21, except it be for this one voice that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day. So Paul finishes his defense here by saying that really the only reason he was there is because he was teaching and preaching the resurrection. And that was a great Jewish doctrine, because they believed, we just read the scriptures where they believed in the resurrection. But no one, not even the Pharisees or the Sadducees, either one, wanted to hear about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Just general resurrection, maybe some of them was okay with, but not in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. They didn't want to hear any of that. So we'll stop here and see what Felix has to say next, starting next week when Felix finally talks and addresses some of the things here that Paul had to say. So we'll start here, Lord willing, chapter 24, verse 22 next week.